The ship is already pulling away from the beach when he changes his mind. He's standing in the surf, soaked to the waist, screaming for them to turn the boat around to let him back on board, that he was wrong, that he'll take his chances with a sinking hull and an 8-month voyage home rather than this. Nobody comes back for him. The longboat keeps rowing. Behind him is nothing but volcanic cliffs, wild goats, and the sound of sea lions roaring somewhere in the dark. In front of him, getting smaller by the second, is the last ship, the last crew, the last human face he will see for the next 1,183 days. This is not a movie. This is not a novel, even though it would go on to inspire one of the most famous novels ever written. This actually happened to an actual man on an actual island 400 miles off the coast of Chile, and by the time his ordeal finally ended, he would come back from it so changed that the men who found him weren't sure at first whether he still remembered how to speak. His name was Alexander Selkirk, and to understand how he ended up standing alone in that surf watching his only way home sail off without him, you have to go back a few years earlier, to a hot-tempered, restless young man from a small fishing town on the coast of Scotland who was, by almost every account that survives him, absolutely nobody's idea of easy to get along with. Selkirk was born in 1676 in the town of Lower Largo, the seventh son of a shoemaker, and even as a teenager, he had a well-documented habit of getting into trouble. Church records from the local parish show him being formally summoned to answer for what was politely described as indecent conduct, and rather than show up and face it, he simply ran off to sea instead. That single decision, made by a headstrong kid trying to avoid a scolding, would eventually put him on a collision course with one of the strangest survival stories in recorded history. By his late 20s, Selkirk had become a skilled and experienced sailor, tough enough and capable enough to be given real responsibility. And in 1703, he signed on as sailing master of a privateering ship called the Cinque Ports, part of a small squadron, sailing under the overall command of the famous explorer and buccaneer William Dampier. Privateering, if you're not familiar with the term, was essentially government-sanctioned piracy. Britain was at war with Spain, and ships like the Cinque Ports were legally authorized to raid Spanish shipping and settlements across the Pacific, splitting the plunder between the crew and the crown. It was a dangerous, violent way to make a living, but it was also, for a while, an extremely lucrative one, and Selkirk had every reason to believe this voyage would set him up financially for years to come. It didn't work out that way, and the reason it didn't work out has everything to do with the ship itself. The Cinque Ports was in bad shape. It had been at sea for a long time. Its timbers were rotting, and worse, it was infested with shipworm, a parasite that literally eats through a wooden hull from the inside out. Selkirk, as sailing master, was one of the men most directly responsible for the seaworthiness of the vessel, and he could see exactly how much danger they were in. In September of 1704, the squadron put in at a small, uninhabited chain of islands off the coast of Chile called the Juan Fernandez Islands to take on fresh water and supplies. And it was here that Selkirk finally confronted his captain, a young, inexperienced, and by most accounts fairly reckless officer named Thomas Stradling. Selkirk argued, forcefully and repeatedly, that the ship was not fit to continue the voyage, that it would sink long before they made it home, and that continuing to sail on it was, in his professional judgment, a death sentence for everyone aboard. Stradling didn't just disagree, he got angry, and Selkirk, never a man to back down from a fight even when backing down was clearly the smarter move, pushed the argument to its breaking point. In the heat of the moment, he told his captain he would rather be left behind on the empty island in front of them than get back on that ship. It was the kind of thing people say in the middle of an argument without fully meaning it, a bluff, an attempt to make a point. Except Stradling called it. He ordered Selkirk's belongings loaded onto a small boat, rowed him to shore, and made it clear he intended to leave him there. And this is the moment where the story turns, because as the boat started pulling away, the full weight of what was actually happening hit Selkirk all at once, and he panicked. He waded into the water, shouting, begging to be allowed back on board, telling them he'd changed his mind. It didn't matter. The Cinque Ports sailed on without him, and Alexander Selkirk was now completely, utterly alone, watching the only ship on Earth that knew where he was disappear over the horizon. He wasn't left with absolutely nothing. He had his sea chest, some clothes and bedding, a single flintlock musket with a small amount of gunpowder and shot, a hatchet, a knife, a small cooking pot, a Bible, and some navigational instruments and books. It was, by the standards of a formal marooning, actually a reasonably generous set of provisions, since captains sometimes left mutineers or troublemakers with nothing but the clothes on their back. But generous or not, it was nowhere close to enough to survive indefinitely, and Selkirk had absolutely no idea standing there on that beach that indefinitely was exactly what he was about to face. And here's the detail that makes this whole story even more remarkable, because it means Selkirk was right in the most brutal way possible. The Cinque Ports sailed on without him, exactly as it had sailed into that harbor, rotting hull and all. It didn't make it much further. Historical records place it sinking not long afterward off the coast of what is now Colombia. And the surviving crew members, the very men who had rowed away laughing while Selkirk begged to come back aboard, were captured by the Spanish and thrown into brutal captivity, with several of them reportedly dying in prison over the years that followed. The ship Selkirk had refused to sail on, the one he'd staked his entire future on being unseaworthy, went down almost exactly the way he'd warned it would. He had traded a slow, uncertain death alone on an island for what turned out to be, statistically, the better odds. He just had no way of knowing that at the time, and neither did anyone else for years. The first months were, by his own later account, close to unbearable, and it's worth sitting with just how genuinely brutal this stretch of his ordeal actually was, because it's the part that tends to get skipped over in the shorter, sanitized versions of this story. Selkirk sank into a state that we would today almost certainly recognize as severe depression. He barely ate. He didn't build shelter. He simply sat on the shoreline for hours at a time, staring out at the empty ocean, watching for a sail that never came, waiting for a rescue that, as far as he knew, might never happen at all. The island itself seemed to be actively working against him in those early weeks. It was home to a huge, noisy colony of fur seals and sea lions that gathered on the beaches to breed, and their roaring, especially at night, was constant and terrifying, loud enough that Selkirk genuinely struggled to sleep anywhere near the coast. He grew violently ill from eating shellfish that didn't agree with him. He had no fire for a stretch of time, uncertain how to properly strike one, eating what little food he found completely raw. Historians who have studied his account describe this early period as the closest Selkirk came to actually dying on the island, not from any dramatic accident or animal attack, but from simple, grinding despair, the kind that convinces a person there's no longer any point in trying. Something in him broke, and then, slowly, something in him rebuilt itself instead. Nobody knows the exact turning point, whether it was a single moment or a gradual accumulation of small decisions, but at some point, Selkirk stopped waiting to be rescued and started instead preparing to actually live. He moved away from the noisy, exposed coastline and relocated inland into a quieter valley shaded by pimento trees, a fragrant, aromatic wood that would end up playing a critical role in almost everything he built over the years that followed. He constructed 2 small huts from pimento branches and long grass, one to sleep in, one to serve as a kitchen, and lined the inside with the skins of the island's wild goats, animals whose ancestors, it turns out, had actually been intentionally released on the island decades earlier by a previous Spanish sailor, specifically so that future shipwrecked or marooned sailors would have something to hunt and eat. It's a strange, almost eerie detail that the very animals keeping Selkirk alive were there because someone, long before him, had once thought exactly this kind of situation through in advance. Hunting those goats became the foundation of his entire survival, but it very nearly killed him at least once. He grew skilled enough at chasing them down across the island's steep, rocky terrain that he reportedly began outrunning them entirely on foot, an ability that later, when he described it to the sailors who eventually rescued him, they found almost impossible to believe. On one hunt, he leapt after a goat near the edge of a cliff, misjudged the drop, and fell hard enough to knock himself completely unconscious, lying injured and alone at the base of the fall for what he later estimated was somewhere close to a full day before he regained consciousness and managed to crawl back to his camp. There was no one to notice he was missing, no one to come looking. If that fall had been slightly worse, his story simply ends there, on a rock, with nobody on the planet ever knowing exactly what happened to him. He survived it, and from that point forward, his relationship with the island only grew more sophisticated. When his gunpowder finally ran too low to safely hunt with the musket, he adapted, using dogs, if you could call them that, actually feral cats he had personally trained to help him corner and catch the goats instead, chasing them down and finishing the job with nothing but a knife and raw physical speed. He kept fires burning continuously by rubbing pimento wood together, having learned through what must have been an enormous amount of frustrating trial and error exactly how to coax a flame out of the island's specific timber. He used his knife, sharpened again and again on stones, to fashion new tools as his original ones wore down or broke. When his clothes eventually rotted apart in the humid island air, he made new ones out of goatskin, sewing them together with a nail he'd hammered and reshaped into a crude needle, using threads pulled from an old unraveling piece of linen. His shoes wore out early on and were never successfully replaced, so for most of his 4 years on the island, Selkirk simply went barefoot, and by the time he was eventually found, the soles of his feet had reportedly toughened so completely that he could run full speed across sharp volcanic rock without pain, something the sailors who rescued him watched him do and genuinely struggled to comprehend. Food, once he moved past the raw shellfish that had nearly finished him off in those first grim weeks, turned out to be far more varied than the popular image of a castaway living on nothing but coconuts might suggest. Beyond the wild goats, the island carried its own strange, half-forgotten agricultural history. Earlier sailors, passing through the Juan Fernandez Islands over the decades before Selkirk ever arrived, had left behind small plantings of turnips and cabbage, crops that had since gone feral and spread wild across parts of the island, and Selkirk found and cultivated patches of both to supplement the meat from his hunting. He harvested the soft inner core of native cabbage palms, gathered wild black pepper berries that grew in abundance, and used them to season his meals, going so far, according to his own later account, as to boil his goat meat with turnip and cabbage into something resembling an actual stew rather than simply charring meat over a fire night after night. He fished from the rocky coastline and gathered crawfish and other shellfish once he'd learned, through hard experience, which varieties were safe to eat. It was, by the standards of true castaway survival, an almost balanced diet, and historians studying his account have pointed to it as one of the clearest explanations for how he managed to stay not just alive, but in reportedly excellent physical condition for over 4 consecutive years. And then there were the rats. The island was infested with them, most likely descendants of rodents that had escaped from earlier passing ships, and they became one of the most persistent, exhausting threats of his entire ordeal, not through any single dramatic encounter, but through sheer relentless nightly harassment. They would swarm his hut in the dark and gnaw at his exposed feet and hands while he slept, sometimes drawing blood, and there was seemingly no way to fully keep them out. His solution, when it finally came, turned out to be one of the more oddly touching details of his entire time on the island. Feral cats, likely also descended from ship's cats abandoned or lost by earlier vessels, roamed the island in reasonably large numbers, and Selkirk began deliberately feeding them scraps of goat meat to lure them closer, gradually taming a group of them well enough that they took to sleeping in and around his hut at night, forming a living barrier against the rats. Over time, according to the account he later gave, he ended up with dozens of semi-tame cats and young goats living around his camp, animals he had personally raised and trained, and on evenings when the isolation became too much to bear silently, he would reportedly sing and dance with them, the only companionship of any species he had access to for well over 4 straight years. Loneliness like that does something to a person, and it's worth being honest about that rather than skipping past it in favor of the more adventurous survival details. Selkirk later admitted that there were long stretches, particularly in the first year, where he seriously questioned his own sanity, where the total absence of another human voice began to feel like its own kind of slow, quiet torment, separate from, and in some ways worse than any physical danger the island presented. He read from his Bible daily, partly for religious comfort and partly, by his own account, simply to keep his ability to read and process language from atrophying completely in a world with nobody to talk to. It worked mostly. When he was finally rescued, he could still speak, but those who found him noted that his words came out slowly at first, oddly spaced, almost as if he were relearning in real time exactly how conversation was supposed to work. The island wasn't entirely his alone either, and this is a detail that often gets left out of the shorter versions of his story, but which adds a genuinely tense layer to the whole ordeal. The Juan Fernandez Island sat close enough to the South American mainland, and close enough to established shipping routes, that Spanish vessels occasionally passed by or put in for supplies, exactly the way Selkirk's own ship once had. Spain and Britain were, at this point in history, actively at war, and a Scottish sailor found alone on a Spanish-claimed island was not likely to be treated as an unlucky castaway, deserving of rescue. He was more likely to be treated as an enemy combatant, and by some historical accounts, potentially even forced into labor in Spanish silver mines, a fate arguably worse than staying exactly where he was. On at least 2 occasions, Spanish ships did land on the island while he was there. Selkirk, watching them approach from a hidden vantage point, made the decision both times not to reveal himself, and on one particularly close call, Spanish sailors reportedly came near enough to his hiding place, high up in the branches of a tree, that he could hear them talking directly beneath him, close enough that discovery would have meant, at absolute best, capture, and at worst, being shot outright as an enemy privateer caught trespassing on Spanish territory. He stayed silent. They eventually moved on, and Selkirk climbed back down into a solitude that, for all its crushing loneliness, was still safer than the alternative. Years passed this way. 1, 2, 3. His hair and beard grew long and matted. His clothes were entirely goatskin by now. He had built essentially from nothing a fully functioning, self-sufficient existence, complete with his own hunting methods, his own domesticated animals, his own fire-starting technique, and his own daily rhythms and routines on an island with no other human being to share any of it with. And every single day, without fail, he made the climb up to a high lookout point on the island and scanned the horizon for a sail. For over 4 years, there was nothing there. Then, on the 1st of February 1709, that finally changed. 2 ships appeared off the coast, and Selkirk, watching from his lookout, did the only thing he could think to do. He built the largest signal fire he was physically capable of constructing and set it blazing on the highest point of shoreline he could reach, desperate for anyone aboard those ships to notice it before they simply sailed past the way every other empty horizon had for the last 4 years. They noticed. The two ships were the Duke and the Duchess, privateering vessels under the command of an English captain named Woodes Rogers. And in one of those details that feels almost too perfectly written to actually be true, the ship's pilot, the man responsible for navigation, was none other than William Dampier, the very same commander whose original squadron Selkirk had sailed with years earlier, and who had personally been part of the decision-making that put him on this specific island in the first place. Dampier recognized the location immediately and reportedly told Rogers exactly who they were likely to find there. A landing party rowed ashore, and what they found waiting for them on the beach, according to Rogers' own written account published a few years later, was almost impossible to process at first. A man dressed entirely in roughly stitched goatskins, with a wild, overgrown beard, who ran and leapt across the rocky shoreline with an agility that stunned even experienced sailors, and who, when he finally opened his mouth to speak to them, could barely get the words out smoothly, his voice rusty and halting from over 4 years of almost total disuse. It took him time, once aboard the ship, to properly reintegrate even basic conversation, and longer still to reacclimate to cooked, seasoned food after years of eating everything, essentially raw or simply roasted over an open flame. Rogers, both intrigued and genuinely impressed by what this man had managed to accomplish completely alone, gave Selkirk an informal, half-joking title among the crew, governor of the island he'd just been rescued from. Selkirk, for his part, appears to have taken real, quiet pride in exactly what he had survived. By the time the crew's own numbers were counted, Alexander Selkirk had spent 383 days completely alone on an uninhabited island in the Pacific Ocean, from September of 1704 to February of 1709. That's 4 years and 4 months, without a single other human being to speak to, help him, or even simply confirm that he was still, in fact, real. His story doesn't end on that beach either, and the rest of it is almost as wild as the marooning itself. Selkirk rejoined Woodes Rogers' crew, initially as a mate, and went on to take part in one of the most successful privateering voyages of the entire era. Rogers' expedition raided the Spanish-held port of Guayaquil, in what is now Ecuador, and went on to capture several prize vessels along the South American coast, including a heavily laden Spanish merchantman that made virtually everyone aboard, Selkirk included, considerably wealthy by the standards of the time. Selkirk's years of self-reliance on the island had clearly not dulled his usefulness as a sailor either. Rogers placed enough trust in him to eventually give him command of one of the captured prize ships for a stretch of the voyage home, an extraordinary turn for a man who, not long before, had been unable to string together a full sentence without stumbling over the unfamiliar rhythm of human conversation. He finally returned to Britain in October of 1711, a full 8 years after he had originally set sail, and found himself, almost overnight, something close to a minor celebrity. Woodes Rogers published a detailed account of the voyage titled A Cruising Voyage Round the World, including a lengthy description of Selkirk's years alone on the island, complete with striking details that quickly became public fascination. Among them, the claim that Selkirk had, over the years, personally tamed and kept company with several hundred goats, and an even larger number of half-wild cats, all raised entirely by his own hand. Shortly afterward, the prominent essayist and journalist Richard Steele wrote and published his own separate profile of Selkirk's ordeal in a periodical called The Englishman, based on interviews conducted directly with the man himself. Selkirk's story spread quickly through London society, and it caught the attention of a writer named Daniel Defoe, who drew heavily on the broad outline of Selkirk's experience, a lone sailor marooned on a deserted island, forced to survive entirely through his own resourcefulness, when he sat down to write a novel published in 1719 under the title Robinson Crusoe, a book that would go on to become one of the most widely read and endlessly adapted stories in the entire history of English literature. But here's the strange, quietly sad postscript that most retellings of this story tend to leave out entirely, and it might be the most human detail in the whole account. Alexander Selkirk, after everything he went through to survive and return home, after becoming wealthy and locally famous, after finally getting back the very thing he had spent over 4 desperate years fighting to reclaim, never actually settled comfortably back into ordinary life. Friends and acquaintances who knew him after his return described him as restless, withdrawn, and strangely uncomfortable in normal society, someone who reportedly built himself a small isolated shelter in his own family's garden back in Scotland, just so he could occasionally retreat somewhere quiet and alone. Whatever those 583 days had done to him, they had changed something fundamental that simply never fully reversed. Within a few years, Selkirk went back to sea, once again as a naval officer, And in 1721, while serving aboard the HMS Weymouth off the west coast of Africa, he contracted yellow fever and died, and was buried, as was custom for sailors who died at sea, in the ocean itself, with no headstone, no grave, no fixed point on any map marking exactly where he ended up. The island where it all happened still exists today, still sitting roughly 400 miles off the coast of Chile, still home to descendants of the very goats that once kept a desperate, half-starving Scottish sailor alive. In 1966, the Chilean government officially renamed it Robinson Crusoe Island, permanently linking the real place to the fictional story it helped inspire. Archaeologists have since identified physical remains at what's believed to be the actual site of Selkirk's original camp, including fragments consistent with navigational instruments from exactly the right period. Quiet, tangible confirmation that everything you've just heard wasn't legend, was an exaggeration passed down and inflated over 3 centuries of retelling. It happened to a real, specific, deeply flawed, and genuinely remarkable man who survived 1,983 days completely alone through nothing but sheer, stubborn refusal to simply give up, and who then discovered, after finally making it home, that the person who walked back into ordinary life was never quite the same one who had been left behind on that beach in the first place.